Our next presenter is Amir Sharifi, and his partner Ali Ashouri could not be here today, so he'll be presenting on behalf of both of them. And the title of his project, Cultural Revival in the City of Kermanshan, a new cartography on contested identities. All right, so let's give him a nice warm welcome as he is connected here.
Let's pray. Okay, so I'm not going to be talking about illusionary spaces, but spaces of illusion. The city of Kermanshan, which is about 2 hours away from my hometown. So it's an ancient city, very old, one of the most ancient cities in Iran, and one of the most ancient in the ancient civilized East, as a matter of fact. It is very diverse, climatically, geographically, linguistically, and also religiously. It seems that the whole diversity of the world has come to this place on earth, the lost paradise. A beautiful land as well. This is Bisutun, which primarily contains inscribed, many centuries ago, multilingualism, an inscription in several languages that the city primarily continues to cherish and inhabit. However, the Foucault's basically spirit has come to the city. It came to the city a long time ago, meaning that a city that linguistically is so diverse, and I have some of the languages that are spoken in the area, Kadhor, Kermanshani, Sorani, Ilami, or Pali, Laki, Horami, and Persian. I'm going to be talking about basically the influence of Persian, which is a language that does not belong to the area, even though the city of Kermanshan is within the Iranian geographical territory, and it has been in that basically Iranian plateau for centuries. So to get a sense what the daily encounters are like, I'm going to show you a very short video, a typical basically interaction. This is issued by the city's DMV. So you will basically hear a cab driver who is trying to attract passengers, and then you will hear basically an impatient passenger who is trying to get somewhere, but the cab driver is not willing to go until he gets more passengers. And then a lackey, another driver basically comes. Then eventually they get on the road and they converse in 2 different languages as the radio basically announces news in standard Persian. So you would hear all these languages.
Kermanshan seni bebriyim. Kermanshan yenaftar. Kermanshan çermendaka. Kermanshan berarken. Ay rahada. Böyle biçimedi. Fakaran gireftarım. Bedbakti girin. Aydedim kal muntazirim. Böyle biçimedi. Başa dadaş miyim? Aysa yenaftar biz razı bana kadar ki ben şişarı diyeyim yan. Ay gönül koruyucu kadar zaten. Yani havası bu. و 4 و فرگن والیه یعنی چند تا فوق نه داداش برو 30 جمع بکن یه چیز به شما میگی خداوندی تو چلمگواتش هم رفتم برو دیگه برو
ای خواه زانی ای و چیز زانی نه من به خاطر خواه میشم آقا خواه هر جوری خواه زانی تو این
خاطر جواز بکنم باشه آقا برا اینو دیدی سیوره خداوندی همیشه چپش بکنه خودم درش میاد یک رفاه آمد
سلام علیکم وقت شما بخیر به مسافرین محترمی که قصد عبور از گردنه ها را دارند لطفاً زنجیرهای
So anyway, I think that really gives you a sense about the linguistic diversity of the place on a daily basis. So what has happened in this city and what is the kind of basically threatened space or the securitization of the linguistic and cultural diversity of this city? What is threatening it? So what is ironic is both Kurdish and Persian belong to Indo-Iranian languages. They do have a common history linguistically, but they are distinct, separate languages. 200 years ago, the city came under the political and economic influence of so-called Persian emissaries. Even though these functionaries were very few, but they were very influential, and they came to exert a great influence to create a cultural and linguistic change or shift, if you will. So the local population had to deal with the political and cultural hierarchy that these people were bringing to the city, and therefore marginalizing the language or languages spoken in the city itself. So proliferation of Persian hegemony, as a matter of fact, elevated the dominant language ideology, and Kurdish was stigmatized and marginalized. Now, the new cultural and linguistic boundaries that were drawn between the center and the periphery, and between the ethnic and religious and putative and local spaces, day by day, basically widened. And language restrictions and discriminations became institutionalized in the city, meaning Persian became the official, the standard, the high, the prestigious language at the cost of Kurdish. So what I am basically arguing is this process went through 4 different stages. And I would argue that the surveillance and creating basically this space of a hegemonic state definitely has succeeded in many ways. But there are some intellectual revivalists, scholars, artists that are reviving the culture and the linguistic diversity of the city, and therefore I would call them cultural revivalists. And in that sense, as you will see, the city has gone through a transformation, if not a metamorphosis, but there are hopeful signs of cultural and linguistic revival. So I would characterize stage 1 as the stage of centralization and subordination. This is where Kurdish is contested. And when I say it is contested everywhere in public spaces as well. On schoolyards, for instance, I, for one, was basically forbidden to speak my language in the schoolyard, in the classroom itself. Then there comes the assimilated identity, that is the contested identities and political asymmetries. Then we have stage 3. This is basically where we have bilingual identities. Writers, poets, linguists, artists seek parity within the context of relaxation of language policies. These periods have happened and allowed basically bilingual artists, scholars, linguists to reassert themselves linguistically and culturally. And then we have basically this stage, which is cultural nationalism or revival. This is where many Kurdish writers, poets, are reasserting their indigenous and authentic identity. In other words, if these people write in Kurdish or compose their poems, and I will go over some of their poems, in Kurdish and Persian, this group entirely writes in Kurdish, which is a kind of a basically rebellion against basically the colonizer. In this case, the colonizer is not basically the fictitious one in the novel, which definitely happened in reality, but the colonizer is the based homogenic or the Persian basically state, so to speak, as a controlling agent. So again, to get an idea of what each stage is about, I call this linguistic imperialism because of the limitations and the control and the surveillance it imposes on public spaces, not educational, not just administrative spaces, but all spaces. So the valorization of Persian and the denigration of local identity. This is what happens here. In stage 2, attempted conversion of local people into Persian, assimilated identity, and iconic erasure of local forms. It is interesting that during this stage, a new generation comes about. For the lack of a better term, I use the term semi-lingual, meaning that they are neither proficient or fluent in Persian nor in Kurdish. So it's a kind of a hybrid language which is confined to its own spaces. Why? Because both societies, in a way, somewhat disparage and belittle these so-called semi-linguals. Stage 3, this is where cross-linguistic and cultural boundaries take place. For instance, the Iranian Revolution, for instance, happens. The Iranian Revolution provides a political context, a degree of cultural freedom for a brief period of time. And these are the historical moments in which the cultural revivalists basically reassert their own sense of identity, and they produce basically in a language that was forbidden. If not forbidden, for instance, to be spoken at home, for instance, in my hometown, but it was forbidden to learn how to read and write in that language. As a matter of fact, I have told my students repeatedly that I learned how to read and write in my own language after I finished graduate school. And it is paradoxical. Now, you get a sense about the kind of restriction basically the Kurdish society in Iran was facing and is still facing. And stage 4 is where there is a reenactment of Kurdish identity through cultural revival, creativity, ingenuity, authenticity, and authority. So the cultural revivalists, this is spearheaded by intellectual linguists, scholars. It is not in one particular category, even though I'm going to be focusing on poetry more specifically. So the cultural production is vast and varied, but I'm going to be limiting myself to the role of poets. This quotation might be significant. The intellectuals, chiefly historical scholars and artists, have been the formulators of the historicist ideology of cultural nationalism and established the first cultural institution. They play an important role as moral innovators, constructing new matrices of collective identity. I refer to the group as ethnic revivalists, those who perceive the nation as a creative force that evolves through periods of decay and regeneration in competitive interaction with a world of similar groups. So again, this is how I plan, this is formative to write a couple of book chapters on this very topic. But again, as I said, I'm going to be focusing on poetry. So in stage 1, there was justification. Intellectuals, poets, basically they had no choice. They justified the subjugation and the language subordination of their people and of obviously themselves. So they were subservient to the political design and doctrine of the hegemonic state. They wrote in Persian, and this is a typical, basically, example of prominent author, and this is one of his works, a poem. I don't want to go over the point. Here is another one who was an accomplished author, a playwright from the same city of Kermanshan, actually who passed away last year. He wrote basically mostly in Persian, even though the theme of his work was predominantly Kurdish, but he could not or he did not write in Kurdish. So we come to stage 3. These are bilingual and bicultural, basically, identities, meaning that these are those who write both in Persian and also in Kurdish. So this is one. By the way, my co-presenter is a native speaker of this language variety. I'm sure I cannot echo him and the native speakers because I speak a different dialect of Kurdish, which is called Sorani, and this is in Kalhuri dialect. But anyway, I'll just read so that you know how it sounds. The first 2 or 3. Desem ktewi ki gir, zuanim biyashir, duena show hasarek mer, meaning, I reached out for a book, it became poetry. Last night a star died, lonelier than the loneliest traveler, more mute than the windows in town, still the sea is in sight. Still the horizon is in sight, still the sound remains. I have set fire in the mute garment. Life said, what a misfortune. The garment turned cold. Which hand of sorrow has fallen over my shoulders more faithful than yours? So this is basically by Qasim Arjan, a Laki poet, a very powerful, basically, poem. What is interesting about these poets, of course, poets influence one another, but they have authentic and genuine, basically original themes in their poetry, but also not only that, but also the poetic structures that arise from the language itself. It lends itself to free poetry or blank poetry, as you could probably hear it in the translation, if not lost. This is another, basically, poet of that generation. I'm not going to read it. This is, again, stage 3, bilingual, meaning Kurdish and Persian. This is Kurdish script. As you can see, it's in Arabic script because the poet lives in Iran, and that is what the common script is. Kurdish as a language is written in multiple scripts, including Latin, Cyrillic, and Arabic, and I guess that's it. I have to invent another one to bring all together. So just to get a feel, I'm lonelier than the moon, mother. This is the title. Starless nights, tears glimmer in my mother's eyes, not for the moon and its loneliness, neither for my fatherlessness, but for the lights that are out. For all the lights that are out for speechless children. The stars of my mother's eyes are my brothers and sisters who have grown up in my poetry. Starless nights, my mother's eyes are the homeland of the poor of the world, brimmed with pain. Your eyes, where are your eyes, my dear mother? I am lonelier than the moon. So, to hear basically a poet, let's just at least hear a few lines of this. And if you could just follow. This is a poem that I have translated, or rather we have translated. The poem has not started yet. Just greeting now. So this is a Kanuri poet. This is a recent recitation. You will see how poetry occupies a very important space in the Kurdish basically culture and public stuff.
مبینم ایشان درابو ولو کردستان بیشون لو دیشون دال آواز بار لمور هاودن شوکیان که زامیلم قردانو مل روالت جنسی دم دسی جن خیابی جیان پیپنک پیتارگا جیان پیپنک پیتارگا که کروره هر پنجه داست لفاممو من آفاممو فامیکم ای گورانی ناپشه که خدا جمیده کیزانه حاجی خدا دویترک لی ولات بانگ توی دورو بگی خدا و دیار سر کسونیو مپارخه خسیسمو لی دیاری پیشتر کرش حلاتمه یه 5000 جار حرکته لهیرمانم توش بساسو مهمان و شعرغانم سان و سان کتم روانی نشتمانکم که جامک خگانی لدرونم سیاتت داروشین ملکی سیوراتکم.
So I'm made up by poems, she says, that have become barren. Poems that are, after blinding my eyes, I'm made of my poems. A patch of the east that has pricked its shroud. Oh, mother, I'm finished. I'm those daughters I aborted in my womb. In the sad twilight of sunset, I was breathing my last breath. Let my coffin be carried on the shoulders of the north wind. Deliver my body to the cemetery of the land, the familiar land of Diyarbakir, which is one of the cultural capitals of divided Kurdistan. It is in Turkey, that city. Actually, last year it was brutally ruined by the Turkish military. So this is basically, the themes of their poetry are very different. She writes also in Persian, but her style of writing is drastically different from she does. This is stage 4. I'm just giving you one example in this category. And this is basically those who have decided. It is interesting. I don't know if it is a great service. I would assume it is only to write in Kurdish. Of course, to write in Kurdish is to commit basically literary suicide. You know why? Because very few Kurds can read. However, what has made basically poetry accessible, that you don't have to be able to read it, you can just listen to it. So with proliferation of the media, we have basically this ability to listen to poetry rather than read it. So you show Waran Shoa. Tonight it's such a rainy day. A cold, endless, windy night, a cold, feverish thirst. A fairy came to my dream. She asked, do you want to come with me to the sky, to go so far to reach beyond the heavens, to play Jontro around the moon? to run around and on the way to fool around. Although we are worn out and drained, stiff and thirsty, although both your eyes are imbued with sleep, rise. It is not time to sleep. It is not time to close your eyes. Come. Instead of millions of lies and deceit, let us go to the blue meadow, to the burden of day and night. No longer is the earth ours. No longer is God our God. So, hold on. So basically, how do we make sense of this transformation or this development? The third and the fourth revivalists, the bicultural intellectuals, cross linguistic boundaries. They are topographers of different, basically, cultural and linguistic spaces, and they can contest institutional discourses and spaces. The intellectuals create renewed interest in the significance of the Kurdish authentic cultural production and identity, contesting imposed identities and hence imposed spaces. The intellectuals create a medium and symbolic resources for articulation of the new cultural nationalism and authentic identity in counter with the hegemonic and homogenizing Persian. So revivalists, interestingly enough, look back for cultural revival. That is what it means. But in their orientation, ideological orientation, they look ahead towards the future, towards the realms of possibilities. I have great hope in this cultural nationalism or revival. Thank you.